So we just talked about all the different types of fills you have inside of Sketch. Now let's talk about adding some complexity by layering some fills. Now if you don't want to fill on an object anymore, you can go ahead and grab somewhere in its square, although it's a little hard to see. You don't want to click on this image, you don't want to click on the check. You can go ahead and pull it off. And you can hear the little trash can sound, the whoosh. It goes away, and essentially this is an object without a fill. So I'm going to go ahead and click plus, and that adds a basic color fill to it. And my border, I'm going to actually turn up a little bit to 10, just so we can see the border of this object when we go and do our fills. Well, we'll start with a really basic color, just a blue. I like blue. Blue's my favorite color. And I'll do a dark, just a, how about a black? There we go, border, so it's sort of color neutral. Now I'm going to go ahead and click the plus here, and you can see it adds a second fill, and the second fill is a black and white gradient that has different levels of opacity. And you can see I can adjust that too, but it sort of stylizes our blue because it's see-through. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to click up on the white, and I'm going to make it very white. And then down in the black and make it more black. I'm going to make this white a little bit less alpha. I'm going to put the blending mode on overlay. And you can see that adds sort of a lighter, brighter blue and a darker, more saturated blue at the bottom. And I'll go ahead and align that straight like it used to be. Okay, well now I'm going to hit back, and I'm going to add another fill. It gives us that same black and white default gradient. This time, I'm going to put that in multiply mode, and that's only going to darken the bottom. And I'm going to change it from linear to radial. You can see here that now I've got a very different sort of look that I can have. Make this a little bit smaller, make this a little bit wider. And now I've got some roundness to this object. I'm going to add a third fill, and this fill is going to be a pattern. So I'll click over here in pattern, and I'll find a pattern that I like. See, this is pretty cool, and I'll zoom in so we can look. It's sort of like a, I guess, sort of a linen or a cotton. Very tightly woven fabric. So I like that, but I'm going to change this blending mode to screen, so that way only the lighter parts show. And you can see now we have a texture on this blue. Now you'll notice over here in our palette that there's no more add button. Essentially, we've hit Sketch's limit for how many different types of fills can be applied to an object. And I don't know if that's for memory reasons or it's just a program limitation. Or if they said, you know, that's probably not the way you need to be doing it. You could achieve this look several different ways. You could just make an image that looks like this and fill it with this image. There's other ways to get this look. But we have all these fills, and maybe I say, oh, you know what, I'm not interested in seeing what the initial gradient looks like, and I'll turn that off. Or maybe I don't like the round gradient, or the round vignette, I guess you would call it, that I made. Or I want to see without the gradients and just the texture. Zoom in so you can see that texture, so it is still there. And you can essentially use these checkmark boxes to get the effects you like. And of course, because these are all semi-transparent and blending modes, if I do something like change the color, I'm going to get a very different look. So you can keep fills applied, but hide some of them. And of course, if you don't like a particular fill, like say I'm not keen on this guy, I can just take it and drag it right off. And it goes away, and then he lets me add another fill to the whole thing. And depending on how you layer these things, like overlay now is going to do something different than if it did it down here. So you can see these are sort of layers in a palette as well. So I can click this and drag it around and sort of choose the order of stuff that I want to have happen. Like if I put purple on top of everything, you can see the very sort of weird effect that that creates. So I'll drag it back down. So fills can be layered. They're sort of four layers on their own. You can have images on top of gradients, on top of solid colors. You can have them all in independent blending modes. It's sort of a layers palette for each individual object that you're working with. So you can imagine that you can create some pretty complex looking shapes and pretty complex looking objects with different fills that don't necessarily take up any room in your layers palette. Adobe Illustrator fans are probably familiar with the concept of this, called the appearance palette. And Photoshop, I guess it's sort of like a layer style. But both are a little bit different in those programs, and there doesn't seem to be a direct parallel to this sort of four fill layer thing that happens that combines image fills with gradient fills and all these different blend modes at the same time. So now say I'm going to turn off this border here, and say I'm pretty crazy about this cool purple I just made. I can come down to my style presets and always hit plus. And that adds in that purple, so the next time I go to make a shape, like this oval here, I can click on the style preset, and it gives me all of those things. You can see the circle looks a little bit more like a sphere when we do that, and I'll go and take this gradient, just reposition it, maybe shrink it a little bit. And that gives us a nice sort of bouncing ball look to it. Put on a little reflection there. Isn't that cool? So now we have this sort of ball sitting in a plane, and if I really want to put in a floor, I would take a giant rectangle. I'm doing all this really just so you get an idea of the type of things that you can do. Fill, I'll go gradient instead. White to black, I'll flip it. And then I'll take the entire object's opacity. Just dial it back until it's very subtle. And so now we have a ball that's just sort of sitting on a very shiny floor. So you can see how easy it is to start coming up with these geometries and basic things. Coming up next, we're going to talk about working with text. That has some interesting quirks about it, but it's still really cool, especially with textiles. All of it's coming up.